Hello, I'm Diana Bailey, Executive Director of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. Our new physical home is 333 North Charles Street in Baltimore, which is located in the Marian House at the former Women's Industrial Exchange. We also do programs like this virtually and across the state of Maryland. Our mission is adding her story to history to tell our story. To that effort, we've done extensive research of Marylanders involved in the suffrage movement. We've developed portable exhibits and have many other resources on our website, marylandwomen'sheritagecenter.org. On site, we have exhibits for the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame, images and expressions of Maryland women in the arts, Maryland women in STEM career pathways, women of World War II, and we have a pending new research project on the history and the stories of the women of the Women's Industrial Exchange. Please visit us online, joining our mailing list or Facebook, or call me to set up a tour of our site. Today, we're pleased to share several of our subject matter experts to discuss with you the concept and the value of oral histories. To facilitate that discussion, I'm joined by Maria Johnson-Darby, Maryland Women's Heritage Center President. Maria?
Thank you all for joining us today. I'm so pleased to have members of our Maryland Women's Heritage Center board with us, Calen Thomas, Dr. Pamela Young, Gina Marie Lewis, Kate Campbell Stevenson, and Dr. Ida Jones. So we're going to just dive right in, ladies, because we have so many exciting things to talk about. So first, we're going to sort of talk about what is oral history? You know, when did it begin? Why is it important? So Dr. Young, can you kick us off?
Well, there are many forms of personal narratives about a life. Among them, many of you know, biographies, autobiographies, diaries, journals, and letters. But an oral history takes the form of a life story that is told by one person to another person who then records it. An oral history differs from the other mentioned forms of personal narratives in that it is first told aloud and then written by another, and that it is constructed in a relational process in which the narrator collaborates with the listener, allowing them to listen, to share, and then to empathize with her. By using an oral narration relationship, the speaker does three things. The first is to make sense of the randomness of our daily life experiences. The second is to construct herself over time. And the third one is communicating meaning about her life to the listener. When telling one's life story over time, the teller ties together significant events and relationships in her life and shows how they may have changed over the course of her life. By placing her life in context, the oral history narrator is attentive to the historical and cultural setting influencing her life and interprets how those factors affected the way she lived her life. Through this process, the life storyteller or oral historian explains why and how her life happened. In the verbal recounting of her life story, the narrator, while attending to those social and cultural factors in her life, may create a distance between herself as the narrator of the story and the self who is the protagonist of that story. And she does this in order to observe that self and perhaps adjust or edit it, adapt it to the self that's being created in the story. This is most evident when the narrator is making moral evaluations of a former or current self. The listener may hear clues about that when the speaker uses self-evaluative language. Or the narrator may shape her story and self-understanding as a conflict between herself and the society that puts limits, like the telephone puts limits, on her opportunities and desires. This recognition of limiting factors occurs especially in oral histories of those who have experienced subjugation or oppression, living at the bottom of socially structured hierarchies. So why is it important to do oral history? An oral history is important, first of all, because it honors and looks at the person's perspective in how they make sense of their own life experience and how this understanding of life's meaning influences their behavior and the way they live their life. Further, though, oral history telling and recording plays an important role in raising up the experience of those of the non-dominant groups. For example, in our case, women and African Americans, demonstrating how they negotiate their exceptional status, either by challenging and contradicting that status or perhaps accepting it. But the careful listening partner must listen in stereo with two ears, not only of what the dominant framework has to say, but also listen carefully to the counter narratives that show that the narrator does not think, feel, or behave the way the dominant framework says she is supposed to. And now I'll turn it over to Ida, who will tell us when it began and give us some good examples. Yeah.
Dr. Jones, do you want to chime in and give us a little more context and share a little bit of your perspective with us?
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Pam. So as a historian, I've got to contextualize this in terms of history. So the question about what is oral history, thank you, Pam, for setting that up. But when did it begin? In the North American culture, it begins in the 20th century. And because of the nature of racism, there are two streams that I'm going to follow. One is the mainstream and one is the African American stream. So we know that West African peoples were imported into North America, principally came from oral cultures. So histories, customs, rituals, medicine, and science were often transmitted orally from one generation to another. So during the chattel enslavement period, the oral nature of Africans were retained and continued to provide a sense of beingness. We have here in Maryland one of the greatest stories with Kunta Kinte on the Eastern Shore and the nature of the roots, the documentary and the docuseries. So those retentions were maintained. Secondly, those West African cultural spaces had terms. So a griot or griot was a traditional storyteller that held one strand of the cultural story together. And as we morph into becoming African Americans, we have now a group of elders who kind of hold that collectively within any particular family. Most often it's women, because women birth children and communicate culture. African American women in particular become the storytellers or the story keepers, transferring all of that conversation to daughters or sons and anyone willing to listen. So you have that kind of African retention in the culture. And in the modern incarnation for African Americans chronologically, the oral histories really begins in the 1920s with a woman named Ophelia Settle Egypt. And I know Pam will appreciate that. She was a social worker. And so what she sought to do was to capture the stories of formerly enslaved persons that were still living in the 1920s. This predates the WPA and President Roosevelt by a good 10 years. So she was gathering these stories and making sure that they were retained and shared with persons who have no familiarity with the chattel enslavement system. What she did do is she was born in 1903. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. She eventually meets a sociologist, Dr. Charles Johnson at Fisk University, who then takes these stories and publishes in a book called The Unwritten History of Slavery, Autobiographical Accounts of the Negro Ex-Slaves. So this actually predates the WPA. So African American social scientists understood the urgency of capturing those lived experiences before the actual vessel expires. In the mainstream society, they credit Allen Nivens as the originator of the field in the 1940s. So Nivens was the first to initiate a systematic and disciplined effort to record on tape and preserve and make available for future reference recollections deemed of historical importance. And we see the National Park Service picking that up as well with the Japanese internment and other things. So we have multiple streams of cultures that are oral, that are documented, that are preserving stories, because we know that human vessels have a end date and they do terminate, but those stories can live on forever. So
well, and so much of that is also not, so many cultures, parts of the environment don't actually have the opportunity to document, right? So the storytelling is how you can kind of create that stream in communities where academics and academia are not necessarily the mainstream. Is that what you're thinking, Dr. Jones?
Exactly. In that kind of formative years, because there was actually some issue with academics, thank you for bringing that up, who thought storytelling was just fantastic remembrances. They weren't credible. They were just people having hysterical or historical machinations. So we have to now credentialize those oral stories with printed sources. So we had the 2021 Tulsa riots. The African American community knew very well about this. The Black press published about this, but it became revelatory to others outside of that community nearly 100 years later because the story was suppressed. So the idea of the oral stories, people hearing in their families, in that community, and the Black press circulating that conversation kept that tragedy alive.
Because that's so important. We want to keep the stories alive when mainstream press at times may choose selectively what it is that they want to record. And if we're trying to, the goal is to help everyone tell their stories the way they know it from their personal experience. We want to, the goal of that oral histories allow you to do that in a more natural way so that it can be passed from generation to generation through time.
Yes, very much so. And it's also therapeutic. So Pamela might want to chime in on this, and maybe my other co-panels will talk about it, that being able to understand what happened and how that impacted your sense of physical being and mental being really is cathartic to kind of acknowledge that moment. And so regardless of any historic, whether it's 9/11 or the day Kennedy was shot, Kennedy 1 or Kennedy 2, any kind of traumatic experience, telling that story, where were you when this happened? And we all kind of remember where we were when 9/11 happened, and we didn't have the internet as much as we did. Cell phones were very scant. I still have a landline, so I was able to reach out to people. But the idea of that happening in time was just everything was frozen. Because I live in Washington, D.C., so everything was literally just frozen. And people can recount, because in California, they weren't even awake yet, because we were on a chat, and they were like, what are you talking about? Look on the TV. I'm just seeing the weather report. What's happening? So the idea of technology expediting our understanding of story, expediting in terms of reporting in an armchair fashion, or simply processing our own emotions. The orality of an experience links us as human beings, regardless of gender, race, orientation, all of that, because we're still human beings.
Yes. Dr. Young, did you want to chime in about that? I think with a social work background yourself, I would think that the use of stories and how people process them does allow people to maybe handle what's going on inside them, their reactions to things, their being.
Indeed, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we've used the narrative form in our work, but the whole idea of narrative therapy is relatively new, and it is used. And I think that to go back to this thing about building oneself. That's the process, the narrative process. And the other thing I'd like to comment on that Ida mentioned is the thing about memory, that people believe that memory is imperfect and that it's not academically viable. But memory is a major component of doing that life reworking, both in therapy and in giving an oral history, so that we perceive ourselves as changing through time. And that's there's a great body of knowledge around your self is your identity, and you change your persona as you not only mature, but as you have different audiences with whom to speak. And that's where the counter narrative comes in, because when people are speaking to the dominant culture that is telling you what you're supposed to be doing, but you're living your life differently. And both women and African Americans have had to do this for all these centuries. And so that you're building the self for not only yourself, but whoever the audience is who you're speaking to. And the oral way to do it is the way we can protect ourselves without writing it down.
And I think we're more likely to remember them. So we're going to talk to Kate a little bit about women's stories. We know that for most of us, maybe I'm only speaking for myself, but I remember things much better when they're in context of a story in terms of our family and history, and because it allows me to process in my own way as well, to sort of take my life and kind of create that as part of the story. So Kate, tell us a little bit about why it's really important for particularly the women of the family to make sure that they're sharing family stories and they're passing on that knowledge and along to the next generation.
It is so important. And when I think about this, I've spent the last 30 years of my life focusing on this very issue of women's stories, bringing them to light, because oral history, if you can get those first stories live it's absolutely phenomenal. But sometimes you can get a story that's relayed over the years too, down family history. But dealing with women in the family, it gives such a unique lens into what's happened. So many times men have been writing the history books, and women's stories have been pushed aside, or their emotions have been, their whole stories have been really diminutive. And as Pamela was saying, women can define their contributions with family and work and community through the oral history and their stories. It gives such a sense of belonging and connectedness, a grounding to time and place and experience when you can talk with family members and find out your history. It helps be very authentic, finding out who you are, who you come from. But it's interesting because memories of the oldest child versus the youngest in the brood can be very, very different. Interestingly enough, my identical twin sister was just here last night, and we were talking, and she said, "Do you remember fighting a lot when we were kids?" It's just, she said, "I don't." I said, "Oh yeah, we fought a lot, and mostly it was about clothing because we were, as twins, we were splitting 1.5 wardrobes, and we would always end up arguing about clothing or whatever, who's going to wear what when." Which is not that important, but when you're 9 and 10 years old, you have a completely different view of that. But I thought it was fascinating that she had no real recollection of this, when mine were very, very vivid. But women's stories, having them tell the first person, you get their emotions of it, their view of what they were experiencing. In reading books and researching my work, which is bringing to life American women's stories, I found it so fascinating that I started this when I was in 4th grade. And as a 4th grader, I never really thought about women's stories, none at all, until I read a book called The Tall Woman, which was written by Wilma Dykeman. It was a novel, but it was based on a lot of oral histories of Appalachian women that have been passed down, and their struggles about settling that area. And a light bulb went off in my head hearing these incredible stories based on real women. I'm going, wow, women are strong. Women are capable. I mean, here the men have been all killed off, and the women have been stuck at chopping the wood and birthing the babies and taking care of the family, as well as dealing with the crops and the cattle and the horses and so on. That was a light bulb really went off in my head. So since that time, I've really been seeking out women's stories, and definitely when you can get the oral stories, it's so exciting. Talking about that in the family, I'm going to deal with what happened in my family. My mother came from an abusive family. She never talked about her family. My father's family was very fascinating, but my grandmother died on the day I was born. I was born in Michigan. My grandmother died in Iowa. I never had a chance to know her or my other grandmother. So as a young girl, I was always asking questions. What about my grandmother?
Well, and it helps contextualize the experience of whatever you're doing, but also as in relation to world events. So like, if your family lived through the Depression, my grandparents lived through the Depression, and listening to what my grandparents talked about related to that experience is different, at least slightly different than the experience that's in the history book. So I would think that women can contextualize their family's experience in world events or in community events, as well as, whether it's the fight for the right to vote, or whether it's around the ERA,
Exactly.
or whether it allows people to sort of put their own spin on it as it relates to your own family, which helps us experience, kind of decide how we fit into the world.
Exactly. When I was finding out about my grandmother, I was so excited to know. I was researching Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, I was so excited to know that when Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the DAR because Marian was not allowed to perform there, my grandmother resigned from the DAR in Iowa. And my grandfather was furious that that happened. But she made her statement, and she made her wishes and why she did this known to her family.
And then it brings history alive for you and for your
Absolutely.
family, and makes it understand why that's critical, right? It's sort of not just a fact that you're learning as part of your history lesson, but it's how that affects women in your own family, and therefore potentially in your community or in your environment in some way.
Brings in authenticity. And I just want to mention one other thing. You see, my hair is done this way today. My father kept telling me about his mother's hair and how she always wore it up in a swirl and a bun, and how it was a Titian colored hair. And as a fourth, fifth, sixth grader, I'm going, what's Titian? And I looked it up, and actually my aunt was telling me this story as well. And I've been wearing my hair like this ever since I was a teenager, or a variation of it up. And it makes me feel really connected to family. And my daughter has Titian hair, Titian colored hair. So knowing these little tidbits about your family, even though I don't know volumes of information, it really makes me feel connected. And I think these issues of oral history, hearing these stories of how women in your family dealt with crises or challenges, or just the little tidbits about family details, really makes you feel connected and grounded, and I'm a part of something.
And that's a perfect lay into our next topic, that we're going to talk a little bit about how oral histories can fill the gaps in our own experiences, but particularly in the African American history, and uncovering the rest of the story that may not be told in sort of the mainstream. So why don't we kick it off with you, Gina?
Hi. Okay. So I'm sitting here, I'm really excited listening to everything that you all are saying, and just writing down little tidbits about it. And just kind of picking up on what Kate was saying about how in oral histories we connect with our own family stories. And yes, the oldest remembers it differently than the youngest. In our family, there's 22 years between those two, and I'm somewhere in the middle. And even the ones on either side of me don't remember the same story that I remember. So this makes what I'm going to talk about really interesting, which is the visual aspects of oral history. My mother is, I believe, one of our family's greatest historians, and she has these 3-inch binders that have census records, that have letters that people wrote to each other, that have voter registrations. And she has, because there's almost like a team of historians in the family doing this work, she's got all these faxed and I want to say mimeographed, because I'm not even going to call them Xerox booklets and things, because we come from a family of teachers. So I'm sure it was an actual mimeograph machine.
You're probably right.
Yeah. And it's these booklets. But as a consequence, here we are, you want to talk about gaps. It's like a closed gap in an African American family of about 7 generations worth of information. Some of them connected to land ownership in places and times where land ownership just didn't seem a probability. And the most interesting part is we go back to the neighborhood now, and my mother still owns, with some other relatives, still owns the property that my grandmother owned, that her mother owned, that her mother owned. And to contextualize it, my grandmother was born in 1900. So we're talking about something that belonged to her grandmother. I've been doing a lot of work with, developing photo voice as a way to engage people around oral history, for public history and public humanities projects. So when I think about the visuality of it, I think about the way that not just looking at these objects, but imagining, my family coming home for a family reunion, and we put a camera in everybody's hand and we say, okay, go out and we're going to take pictures of the places that are important to you, that help you tell the story. And we come back and, you're developing captions to go along with these stories, and, kind of follow this, because we talked about how oral history takes the place in instances where you may not have the artifacts. But by the time you finish creating this visual narrative, and, some people are doing it via cookbooks and other people are doing it via story quilts. And you're taking these images and bringing them in as a part of, not just to document the story, but as a part of this oral history process where you're helping the person to tell their stories. And when they go out and they engage and they take a photograph and they bring it back and they're processing that, it helps them remember things that maybe they didn't remember. And when you have community groups doing that work and they're bringing together photos, maybe some people have the same photo and a different memory, and some people have a memory and someone else's is, oh yeah, and, so then the visual aspect of it becomes a part of that storytelling. So then, just to push it just a little further, sometimes, in particular with African American histories, knowing those stories can actually impact policy. And that's one of the things, doing work for the National Park Service, is they're actually interested in, when they make decisions about things, how does that impact communities that are connected to those locations and those cultural resources. So having the photos and having the stories then helps to close that gap where someone might say, well, there's nothing in the archive.
When it shows the intersectionality of those kind of two pieces too, both what they remember, what they see, and then what's printed in sort of the press or in some other written documentation. So Calen, let's talk a little bit about the media, the press, the sort of from that perspective. How does that help fill in the gaps?
Well, always think about reporters, whether it be for television, magazines, or newspapers. Reporters are some of the best people to talk to who may have audio recordings of an interview that they've done. Even if the interview is for print, they will still record it. And so I have quite a few audio recordings, some of them on the old school tape recorder, and some of them on my cell phone, of people like civil rights activists who have now passed on. And so you can't interview them right now. So you could go back to someone who has interviewed them, and you can reach out to television stations, newspapers, and speak to that reporter and find out if they will allow you to use some of that work. And a lot of times you do have to get permission from the media outlet. But I have oral histories, pieces of oral histories from civil rights activists like John Lewis, also actress and activist Ruby Dee, and also civil rights activist and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. So those are pieces of information that somebody could use because they have passed on now. And so it's good to reach out to media to find out if they have anything that you could use for your oral histories to fill in the gaps.
And that's a good point, because so many times, whatever we see on the news or in print or in whatever kind of publication is just a fraction of what the story was. It's a part, it's a
Exactly.
summarization of the interview. So I hadn't thought about the fact that to sort of, I think about going and researching those things that have been printed and documented, but there's backstory to that because, as you said, there's recordings that exist, that might tell a greater story or have a different perspective than what was actually shared in the document that was printed or shared on the news or in some other format. That's a good point. So, Dr. Jones, did you want to chime in a little bit about this filling in the gaps and using oral histories to do that?
Yes, I have to commend the journalists because they are the first draft historians, we call them. And so they actually are in the moment and viewing this very clearly. And one of the most notable is Studs Terkel, who was a journalist in Chicago who documented the Great Depression. So he really kind of popularized the idea of oral history, taking it out of our lovely ivory towers there, Pam, and bringing it to the people, the folks. And so as a result, we had women doing this at teas and graduations and weddings and such. So now you have the town and the gown coming together to realize the humanity of telling these stories. But I also want to say that oral history has democratized stories, as well as Gina has mentioned with the technology. So now we've moved from simply these kinds of in-person things to do things digitally, such as this program, and thank you, MPT, for that. But I'm also going to give a plug to the library. The Enoch Pratt Library holds a series of transcriptions and oral histories on record, like Calen has mentioned. So we're all in this together, and I think it's very important for us to kind of document our own narrative, and even some of the people that are millennials under the age of, let's say, 25, because consider their story. Because apparently the iPod is going away. Oh, gee. And in New York City, they just took up the last phone booth with the rotary, So these things are changing. The technology does change how we engage. And they, some of the 20-somethings like, I feel old. I remember the iPod. So
I think that's so interesting. I think that the sort of how we tell stories, as we've been doing this work at the Heritage Center on the women's suffragists, and it's been so interesting because pardon me, history books, that's a little section, right? It's very tiny. Yeah. And the women that you all have spent time really researching and learning greater stories, it brings it alive for the next generation in a different way. People certainly know Harriet Tubman, but there's so many more interesting things than the 3 sentences or the 10 sentences that are written about her in a history book. And, the marker unveilings that we've done with the Pomeroy Foundation across our state have told that story of what it looks like from a woman's perspective, very specifically in all the different counties in our state, which certainly adds to the richness of the dialogue that we hope continues to happen in those counties long after, the unveiling of the markers go on. And that allows us to continue to tell that story. So given that, let's talk a little bit about, what are some tips, some resources, some things that we can do to help people sort of, if they want to begin to uncover oral histories, whether it's their own families or famous people or the suffragists, as we talked about. Anyone want to chime in on that? Anyone have a thought they want to share? Calen?
Well, I just want to mention that watching interview shows on MPT or listening to interview shows on NPR are excellent ways to get ideas for interview questions when you're doing oral histories. So don't bypass media, make sure you check out some of those interview programs because they do a great job with interviewing people and it'll give you some ideas for questions.
That's a great point. Kate, did you want to chime in?
Yes. Also, you think about major events, what happened. We were talking about some of the millennials and so on. How did they react when they had the shooter here in Washington, D.C. area? For over a month, our lives were paralyzed. And that happened 1 year after 9/11. And I know that my kids were going through, my daughter was a senior in high school. She was standing next to a friend when she discovered her father was on the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. So, the traumas that they've been through and trying to, understand that, ask these young people, but also ask your aunts and uncles about what did you do during the Vietnam War? What was your family dynamics at that time? Really get into some meaty discussions. To me, the Vietnam War happened when I was in high school and middle school. And I know that in my hometown, our little town in Michigan was one of the first places to have some soldier die in the Vietnam War. So, I mean, these are some vivid memories that I have. So these major events can trigger talking points for families to really start to understand how they dealt with traumas and challenges and so on.
Well, you can imagine that in some future time from us now, that the world, your grandchildren, great grandchildren, will be asking about COVID, something we didn't think that we would live through, and what that looked like, and how did that affect various parts of the community? Because we know it affected individuals unevenly in terms of our community, and so that allows for further discussion, because it allows the family to contextualize the world experience, which I think is an interesting way, particularly whether you're using the visual arts, as Gina was talking about, or whether we're using some of the oral histories, or whether we're using written histories. Pam, did you have something you wanted to say?
I wanted to say that I think a great resource is Storycore. This is an organization that has people come tell their stories to one another loved family member or friend. And they have a whole page of the kinds of questions you might want to ask. And I think that the idea about asking questions has to be thought out. What is it that you really want to find out about this? When you do an interview study, the way I did, you have to have questions that have to do with your research theories and blah, blah, blah. But asking someone just to tell me your story, and it may be about something like COVID, something specific to get them started. When I started my interview study, my first question was, how do you define your contributions to your world? And I had the best storyteller in my whole study who said to me, I give to save the children. Now, is the interview over? And if I wasn't an experienced interviewer from being a social worker, I would have gotten up and left and missed the 2 best hours of my whole study listening to her story. She gave really clear what the scholars define as story with the whole format. And so I think that we have to be a little bit humble about who we're asking and why and what we're asking them. So if you still have a grandma, or like you said, Kate, an aunt, just tell me about your life. Tell me about your story. Tell me what you did so-and-so time, and then let them go on. And if they're not one of those who is a born storyteller, they'll tell you something else. You'll get there. So I think engage your family and friends.
Sure, and your phones. You're right, Kate.
Yes,
I see you're saying your phones.
Yes.
And all the many forms that are out there now, whether it's TikTok or all these other, all the photos, the videos that are happening, I would think allows families and all of us to have a greater ability to capture stories of ourselves and the people in real time, so that we have personal experiences that then are in reactions to the larger world community for folks. Is there any other, Calen, or Gina, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm glad now we're back to technology, because I am, among my friends, I am the Google queen. If you send it to me and I think I can look it up, I will look it up. One of the things on the project that I'm doing now is, we're talking about the GU 272, which is the 272 people who were enslaved at Georgetown University. And there's a very nice collection of oral histories on a website. I'll share that with you all later, so you can add it to the resources with this. And then also, I don't know, over the years, I've taken times where I just listen to slave narratives, and I think that a lot of times when we're doing work now, we're looking for all kinds of things, and we don't always go back to those stories, but those stories connect to the stories that someone is going to tell you now.
So there's original sources, there's original
talking across generations, of the same family. And I think that, we really weave together a great history when we're able to put together the generations of different stories. And I like that that has come up in several of the comments.
Which is why, Gina, your family of 7 generations of documented history is really going to be a gift to the world, not only to your own family, but 7 generations covers a lot of time in our country, you know, and the world that we live in and how quickly the world has changed, certainly, particularly in the last, 2 or 3 generations. And so that'll be a gift to the world at large. And I think that's true for all of people's individual resources. Kate, did you have something?
Yes, I do. Speaking of a gift of resources, I have over the last, Dr. Nancy Grace Roman, the astronomer and quoted mother of the Hubble telescope, I have on my phone right now over 2 hours of interviews with her and her telling her story about her scientific career and how she started off. And I can't wait to get it to she's a Maryland woman. And I would love to make sure we get that in our archive because it is such a story of perseverance. Because you can imagine being a woman scientist in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s and being pushed aside. And one of the things that just jumped out at me was that she was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, one of the top universities in the country. And when she found out she was making the same money as the janitor, she knew that she was going to have to move on and find a different course for her science where she would be appreciated. And but 2 hours of speaking, no and ums, unbelievably clear. And she was in her late 80s, early 90s when she gave these interviews.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things I've in the griots that Dr. Jones you were speaking about. When they tell their stories, they're able to both give the kind of the interesting visual piece of that, but also contextualize that in terms of both the past communities that they're reflecting on, but also how that relates to today, which really engages audiences. And I think that maybe that's one thing that hopefully everyone took from today that's listening to us is that oral histories allow us to bring forward that which might have gotten lost in the past if we weren't continuing to tell them. Any last minute comments from everyone before we wrap up today's discussion, which will in its own sense be an oral history of your work in this field?
Well, I just like to say that please back up your recordings. That's something I learned the hard way. I was interviewing my elders in the family, and I had a phone that I recorded them on got broken. And at the time, it was years ago, but at the time I didn't know about backing up. And so I lost those interviews and those elders are no longer here. So I'm really upset about that, but I wanted everybody to know, always make sure you back up your recordings. If it's on your phone, back it up in the cloud or on a thumb drive, but always make sure you have a backup.
When digitize photos and things because the old ones get stuck and if they aren't properly archived, and
right,
you're so important. Well, thank you, ladies, for being with us today. It is always an honor to be among you. The Women's Heritage Center is really, really honored to have you join us as part of today's celebration and discussion about women's oral histories, but also for all of the work that you do as part of the center to make sure that women's stories are told, remembered, and valued, not just currently, but for many generations to come. So we appreciate your time today. Thank you to MPT for allowing us to share a little bit about our perspectives on oral histories and the value they bring to our community. And if you have any other follow-up questions, you can certainly check us, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, out on our Facebook page or on our website. Thanks so much and have a great day.